Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at some specific Renaissance artists as represented by the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so you can probably in your mind know that we are going to be covering Raphael, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. What you're hearing in the background is Renaissance music that was composed during the time period as well. And today we're also going to explore at least two people who revolutionized the way that literature is written during the Renaissance. Away we go. So in the previous lesson, we learned and kind of dove in fairly deep to Leonardo da Vinci, and you guys explored a website, and you know that he is considered a Renaissance man because he was more than just an artist. He was a sculptor, an inventor, a scientist, and at the very end of the video clip we watched, he talked about how he felt like everything was connected. And I think that's a really valuable lesson for all of us to be thinking about how the things that we learn are connected with the other things that are taking place around us. Everything, in his opinion, was connected. So, with that being said, I do want you to be familiar with a couple of pieces of his art. The Mona Lisa, of course, you've looked at it a couple of times. The classic example of sfumato, the blending. Remember, sfumato meant smoky in Italian. And so that this smoky blended technique that he uses really revolutionizes art, and it is copied by Renaissance artists post Leonardo. He's also, of course, famous for The Last Supper, which is a fresco, which means that it's painted on a wall, not on a canvas. And as a result, there's one location you can go see that, and it's highly controlled. In The Last Supper, perspective is used, and that was another technique that we talked about in the last unit, how perspective created the illusion of three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface, so that there would be a vanishing line, a horizon line, and a vanishing point, and then lines kind of emerging out. In addition to Leonardo's work, there were also some significant Renaissance artists that were providing other ways of looking at the world and really challenging the system. Raphael advances these kind of techniques that are used to create realism and to even send messages. So Raphael is famous for many works, but the one that I would love to share with you is called The School of Athens. I think the School of Athens is really interesting because the School of Athens, once it pops up here, the School of Athens is painted for the Pope at the time, and it hangs in Vatican City in the St. Peter's Basilica, which is the home of the Pope today. And I'm just going to scroll down and let you see, and then the list, and then we will take a look at the piece of art. But look through the list, and what I'm hoping is that you'll recognize 5 or 6 of these names at least. So we talked about Epicureanism, appreciating fine foods and wines before. So maybe you recognize Epicurus, Pythagoras, Pythagorean theorem, Alexander the Great, we spent quite a bit of time talking about, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, the father of geometry, and Archimedes. We talked about inventions like the Archimedes screw before. Ptolemy, you might be familiar with. So anyway, I'm hoping you recognize some of those names because Raphael chooses to, hang on just a second here, I'm going to show you. Come on. Oh, hang on just a second. Let me see if I have it. There we go. Raphael chooses to paint those figures that were really prominent Greek figures. He paints them right on the wall or right on the canvas that is hung in the Pope's home or the Pope's apartment. And I think that's interesting because Socrates and Plato and Aristotle all would have questioned the way that the Catholic Church worked. Aristotle, remember, he was famous for like the scientific method. He would have been more interested in logic and evidence than in blind faith. So I think that it's kind of interesting that Raphael chooses to paint something that represents people that would have questioned the church at every turn. At least in my opinion, it seems like they would do that. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Raphael even paints himself into this painting, which is again pretty typical of the Renaissance. So School of Athens. Okay, I'm going back. In addition to Raphael and the School of Athens and his use of perspective, Donatello is also a famous Renaissance artist, and his emphasis is on sculpture. So far we've been paying a lot of attention to paintings and frescoes, but sculpture was also important. And some of Donatello's early work includes, let me show you quickly here. Just going to show you how he kind of progressed. This is one of his early pieces of work. St. John the Evangelist. And he actually gets commissioned by a couple of guilds to create pieces of art. This was commissioned for a sword makers and an armor makers guild. And a guild is like kind of a union so he was commissioned to provide a sculpture that would represent kind of the industry. And this is what he created fairly early on. He was commissioned by individual people to create busts of themselves. So this is, again, a great example of humanism during the time period. He helped to decorate the inside of the Medici family kind of cathedral. He helped Brunelleschi do the inside of something called the Duomo, the Opera del Duomo in Florence. So this beautiful Florence cathedral, he'd help decorate the inside. Here's some of his more famous works, though. This is David, a bronze. Is this 5 feet tall? This is probably the piece that you've seen the most often of Donatello's work. And some of his other sculptures, this is a famous piece too, Magdalene Penitent. And this is a life-size piece, and you'll see another image of this in a little bit. But this life-size piece is considered realistic in that it's not concerning something beautiful, but instead something relatable and to be both pitied and admired on a human level. Okay, let's get out of that. Okay, I'll go back to here. So Donatello was focused primarily on sculpture, and this David piece is one of his most recognizable pieces. He also liked to sculpt angels and cherubs. He did a lot of work for the St. Peter's Basilica, and some of his probably the most consistent works that he does is angels and cherubs and sculptures like that. Michelangelo, you are already familiar with, but he's responsible for the Sistine Chapel and the Pietà and David, this version of David. So here's Donatello's version of David, and here's Michelangelo's version of David. I want to explore with you the Pietà, however. I think it might be faster for me to just go like this. There we go. So the Pietà was created by Michelangelo for a cardinal, which is a ranking member of the Catholic Church underneath the Pope. So a cardinal asked him to create this for that cardinal's tomb. So in preparation for his death one day, he had this commissioned. However, it got moved from the tomb location and into St. Peter's Basilica, where it is there today, I believe. And he created this when he was 25 years old. 25 years old. And what's interesting is he started with a big block of rock and chipped away to create this. And I think that that's interesting because it's one thing to think about somebody sculpting, taking hands of, the clay in their hands and sculpting it to create. And it's another to be able to chip away at the void, chip away and leave a void to create something. It seems like it would be even harder, but I'm not pretending to know about that. But this is Mary in Christ. Some of the things that are noted is that this is post-Christ crucifixion. And so Christ would have been about 33 years old when he was crucified. And people note the youth of Mary in this sculpture. Because of course, if he's 33 and that's his mother, that she looks awfully young. But his art historians say that, being pious leaves you with youth anyway. It's just something that people talk about and note. But one of his most famous pieces right there, the Pietà. 25 years old when he creates that. These are some other Donatello works. I just wanted to give you a sense of the work that he does. Here's the one that you've already looked at. Here are the cherubs. I wanted to make sure that you knew that he was an angel and cherub guy. Cherubs are like chubby little angel babies. This is a piece that's supposed to represent Donatello himself. We've already looked at details around Leonardo da Vinci's sketchbook. You know that he was responsible for all sorts of inventions and sketches and exploration of kind of the anatomy of man, paying careful attention to science. Okay, and there's the School of Athens, which is where we will leave off. So you're going to play a Kahoot game that's going to ask you, who's responsible for this piece of art? So be heads up about that. Last piece for today. So I also told you that we would talk about two writers, and two really famous writers that come from the time period. One's named Niccolò Machiavelli. He provides some ideas that are kind of revolutionary and writes in a revolutionary way. And then Dante Alighieri. So Machiavelli and Dante are our last two people to meet today. So what does Machiavelli say that's so revolutionary? So Machiavelli says, he writes about how a political leader should lead. And so there's lots of questions in the Renaissance time period about, what should leaders be like, because we're moving away from this idea of kings and queens. And so then the question becomes, well, then who is next best to lead? And Machiavelli says in his kind of political guidebook, The Prince, he gives advice. And he says, you know what? Some people lead and they want to be liked by all. And that's the wrong way to go about it. That sometimes in an effort to do what's right in the big picture or right for a group, individual people might get hurt in that process. So sometimes you have to do what's right for the group in order to accomplish what's right for the most people. And if you hurt, individual people along the way, well, that's kind of just the way it goes. The phrase "the ends justify the means" is kind of sums up his thinking. That at the end of the day, if you can hold on to power and do the most good for the most people, that however you get there, it's kind of okay. Now, the problem is that sounds like you could lie. It sounds like you could hurt people in the process. And he says, you know what? If you have to choose between being loved and feared, being feared might be okay because it allows you to hold on to power and do the most good for the most people. So Machiavelli writes The Prince, and it's a guide. It's kind of the father of political science. He writes in a way that encouraged people to lead. and not worry too much about whether you have to step on toes in the process or make people angry with you in the process. Definitely sums up a lot of our political leaders today. Dante, on the other hand, he does something different. He writes in the vernacular. So during the Renaissance, we start to see artists write in languages that the average everyday person can understand. And this allows for information to spread amongst the regular population of people. So Dante, for example, decides not to write in Latin like many of the scholars of the day, and instead to write in Italian, in a language where everybody would have access to understanding it. So writing in the vernacular means to write in the everyday language in which the people speak. So a lot of like intellectual kind of educational manuscripts at the time were written in Latin, and only people that were kind of educated enough to be clergy members or educated and fortunate might be privy to the Latin language. And so the masses didn't read Latin necessarily. So when he writes in the vernacular, he's really saying, hey, this information is for everybody. And what Dante does is he explores this whole notion of heaven and purgatory and hell. And that's what your assignment's going to be about today, to pay attention to how he describes it. So he writes something called the Divine Comedy. And the Divine Comedy isn't all that funny. The Divine Comedy is about an exploration of heaven and purgatory and hell. And purgatory is an interesting thing to think about because heaven, we all know what heaven is. And hell, we have a pretty good idea what hell is, thanks to Dante's explanation, which you're going to explore. But purgatory is this idea that if you don't make a choice in this lifetime, if you don't make a specific choice in this lifetime, that you still don't get to go to heaven. Instead, you're stuck. You're stuck in this in-between place because you didn't do enough to make a decision in this life about being proactive, about being proving yourself to God or the other. So here is Dante Alighieri, and we're going to finish with a video that describes the levels of hell, and then you are going to look at your own scavenger hunt of the same. Okay. So here are the levels of hell. There are 9 levels of hell according to Dante. And as you kind of move your way down, you can see the things that he thinks are the worst. It's kind of interesting to me that, violence against murderers and tyrants and people is not as bad as like fraud and lying. Okay, let's take a look.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, hello there. I'm glad you're all here. But before we even begin with this diddly, it would be prudent for us to go ahead and address a few things about Dante's Inferno prior to this presentation. These are serious allegations about a very respected piece of literature, so we should deal with them right away. They are known as things students hate about Dante's Inferno. Number 1. Dante's Inferno was written a long time ago and in Italian. Mozzarella! Number 2. It is very, very long. And number 3. For a piece of literature that is part of something called the Divine Comedy, it just isn't very funny. And that's where we come. Let's start with the author, Dante Alighieri. It's hard to pronounce his last name, so he's more often referred to as just Dante. Now, Dante was born circa 1265 in Florence, Italy. I'm an old fella. He was betrothed to his future wife when he was only 12 years old, but he accidentally fell in love with another woman named Beatrice. They never became an item, and in 1290 she died. Dante suffered terribly. What am I gonna do? And buried his grief by becoming politically active. Now, if you've seen even one episode of The Sopranos, you know Italian politics are difficult. You can act like a man! And before long, he'd made many enemies around Florence, and he was exiled. He wandered the countryside and eventually began writing what would become his greatest work, La Divina Commedia, or the Divine Comedy. Now think of the Divine Comedy as a huge work with three main divisions: Inferno, which we're studying, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. For those of you unaware of old school church canon, these were believed to be your three options when you died: Hell, Purgatory, or Paradise. Now these three main divisions were then comprised of smaller parts called cantos. Each division had 33 of them. So, one work, the Divine Comedy, three divisions, Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise, with 33 cantos apiece, plus an introduction that was one canto. That equals 100 cantos. And the reason there's so much blasted mouth in this film about literature is that numbers and numerology were important to this work. I won't bore you with any more, but keep those in the back of your brains in case we run into them later. Okay, enough of this introductory foolishness. Time to get on with the literature. The Inferno is Dante's idea of what hell will be like. Dante wrote that hell would be made up of different circles, 9 of them in all, which formed a big winding funnel. Ding! He also thought that sinners in hell would be dealt a punishment that was very fitting for their sins. This is called symbolic retribution. You'll see what I mean later. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Inferno is a poem made up of cantos, 33 to be exact, with one canto at the beginning providing an introduction. That's 34 cantos, and nothing short of an Animaniacs hoedown could get us through them all expeditiously. Oh, that reminds me. The number one thing students love about Dante's Inferno, Mr. Announcer Man? That's right, they can use the word hell in class. Oh dear, here we go. Ding! Canto 1 is an introduction to all of the Divine Comedy. Dante gets lost while walking in the woods. He's 35 years old, which is half the biblical age of man. He encounters 3 terrible beasts, which will not let him pass. Suddenly, a man appears in front of him. Who the heck are you? Hello, I am the ghost of Virgil, the 1st century BC Roman poet, and I'll be your tour guide through hell. I represent human reason, and I'll protect you from all those bad mama jambas down under. Now, if you'll follow me, please watch your step. The first place Dante and Virgil arrive is at the gate of hell. Before he even enters eternal damnation, Dante notices that there are a lot of people outside waiting around. It's a lot like the DMV, but the people punished here are in hell because they made no choices. They did not follow God nor Satan, so they're stuck waiting outside the gate. Now, Virgil and Dante have to cross the river Styx to enter hell. Fortunately, there's a ferry service, and the captain is a demon named Charon. Virgil gets tickets and whips Charon into shape. Oh, down, you big demon of hell! And off they go. There's a pretty stiff wind smelling of you-know-what, and Dante passes out. When Dante wakes up, he finds himself in the 2nd circle of hell. Ding! Now, note that circles are symbolic too. Here Dante sees Minos, who is the acting judge of hell. Minos has a long tail, and as the dead souls arrive in hell, Minos decides where they will spend their eternal damnation. He wraps his tail around the center one time for each circle of hell, and then slings them off into the darkness. Once again, Virgil has to protect Dante from a demon. Get away, you silly fiend! And Minos allows the pair of poets to continue. Dante notices that the souls in this part of hell have been damned for their lustfulness. The punishment, apparently, for being too lustful is to forever be tormented and torn apart by a howling wind. Now, this part is important. Dante begins to recognize some of the people in hell. Hey, I know you! And he points them out to the reader. Big deal, you might say, but then again, imagine if someone these days made a movie about hell and then casually started talking about people he found in hell, especially politicians and people who committed adultery. Go figure. Anyway, Dante starts talking to a pair of lovers who share a wicked story about how they got caught boinking each other, but their punishment for this act is so brutal that, once again, Dante passes out. Ding! Wow, we skipped almost to the end. Now, Dante and Virgil in Canto 33 are in the darkest, deepest part of hell, the ninth circle. I should point out that Dante has ordered the sins of the condemned in hell from least to greatest. And it's most important to note that Dante didn't think adultery and lust were as bad as the greatest sin found in the ninth level of hell. Betrayal. Here's another surprise. Dante imagined that this level of hell would be absolutely frozen in ice. Now, do you know all of the things that can happen now that hell has frozen over? Wow! Anyway, Dante sees several gruesome things here, including one dude who is frozen into the ground and who is literally gnawing on the brain of the guy beside him who betrayed him in his previous life. Now, miraculously, Dante doesn't pass out, so they keep going. Ding! Up ahead, in this last canto of the Inferno, Dante and Virgil finally arrive at the biggest mumbo jumbo of them all, Satan. Lucifer is a huge, towering demon. They pause to admire Satan, who was once a beautiful angel in heaven. You may want to take a picture. This lowest of low levels of hell is named Judeca, after Judas Iscariot, the man who in the New Testament betrayed Jesus Christ for 30 pieces of silver. They find Judas along with two other important traitors, Cassius and Brutus, you know, the guys who helped get rid of Julius Caesar. And these three are suffering the worst punishment of all. They are being eternally chewed to death in the mouth of Satan himself. After that, Virgil speaks up. Now that you've seen the big attraction, Mr. Satan, it's time to make our way back to the gift shop. Okay, hold on please, let's go. Virgil and Dante actually climb down the hairy back of Satan, and in a super weird shift of time, gravity, and space, down becomes up, and they make it out of hell to find that it is morning, dawn on Easter Day. They move on to purgatory, but that's a different story now, isn't it? So, my friends, there is a quick-witted look at Dante's own vision of hell, the Inferno. With apologies to all the circles in between, I hope you've enjoyed the first and last parts, and that you're encouraged to read about the parts of hell we skipped. That way, you'll be sure not to end up there. As I always like to say, music may tame the savage beast, but Dante, well, Dante knew he'd need Virgil's help. Oh, hell!
Okay, guys, and away you go. Thank you.